Hey guys, welcome back to this mess. So, in today's video, we are going to be discussing the history, the background, and subsequent arrest of Ruby Franke of 8 Passengers, as well as her not business partner, but also business partner, Jodi Hildebrandt, and her involvement in the abuse of Ruby's children. I'm sure you can tell that this subject matter is very intense, and if you're not in the right headspace for it, please don't feel a need to watch this video. You can absolutely click off and go take care of yourself, but this is going to be intense. To give a brief one-sentence summary of what we're going to be talking about today, Ruby Franke and Kevin Franke, his involvement in this should be noted, are the parents of the family channel called 8 Passengers. And in August of 2023, Ruby Franke and her friend, cohort, whatever you want to call her, Jodi Hildebrandt, were both arrested for the charges of child abuse and child neglect. The evidence that has been put forward regarding those charges is barbaric, cruel, unusual. Anything that you can come up with where you're like, that's an absolute no, has occurred because of these women towards these children. And while I am going to absolutely be giving my opinion on both of these women and Kevin, we're not going to forget about Kevin. At the beginning of the video, I'm going to give a very brief summary of their history, specifically the 8 Passengers channel. I want to also dive into who Jodi Hildebrandt is, her history, because it is very important that we understand who this person is. And then I will get into the current events, which was the August 2023 arrest and the recent February 2024 sentencing of Ruby and Jodi. I will timestamp everything as best I can below if you want to skip around or if you want to refer to a different part. Please feel free to do so. I will also be linking a lot of resources that I utilized for this video and just for my own personal knowledge on this situation below. And if you have anything to contribute, please feel free to do so in the comments, but I ask everyone be as respectful as possible. With that being said, let's get into it. I am also going to be referring to my notes, which are on the screen right here, so if you see me staring and reading, please know that I am trying my best to stick to the material that I have taken a lot of time to collect and write out, but I also understand that it looks a little weird, so I apologize ahead of time. Starting off on the history of who Ruby and Kevin Franke are. In 2015, Ruby started the YouTube channel 8 Passengers, which grew towards the end of the channel's existence to 2.5 million followers. That's a lot, yeah, okay. The purpose of the channel was for Ruby to document her children, their upbringing, in her Mormon lifestyle. If you're unaware, the Mormon community is very abundant in Utah. I believe it's about 66% of the population in Utah identifies with or is an active member of the Mormon community. And my understanding, based on the research I've done, is that the Mormon community relies a lot on each other. They are very resistant to the secular world and the secular resources and very much rely on themselves for things. So for Ruby to start posting about her family and emphasize proudly the Mormon-based religion that they all had was something that really resonated with other people in that community. And obviously people in general are just interested in family channels. I personally don't understand the appeal, but I'm also not a parent, so maybe I don't know. But the big appeal for Ruby and her family was that she was very open about her parenting style and the fact that it was Mormon-based, but also the fact that she was documenting everything. A lot of people felt it was a bit of a TMI in some ways because Ruby was talking about her children buying bras for the first time, menstrual cycles, all this very personal stuff. And there's been a lot of criticism on the way she displayed her children on these channels, which I'm not going to get into too heavily because honestly, there's just so much other stuff we have to discuss. But since the channel's origins, a lot of people have had problems with the way that Ruby disciplines and parents her children. Some of the more prominent examples I'm going to get into because I feel like it lays a good foundation for us to launch into the recent events. Their oldest son, Chad, had revealed on their YouTube channel that he had not been sleeping in a bed for the better part of 6 to 9 months, because he had pulled a prank on one of his younger siblings, Russell, and Ruby's response to this was to take away Chad's bedroom and force him to sleep on a beanbag chair in the family's living room. Now, just saying that, just that alone feels a bit off, right? Like, I understand that it's not good for people or siblings to do pranks to each other. Like, it can kind of be a little fucked up. I get it. But as a younger sibling to an older sibling, that kind of stuff happens all the time. And the prank that Chad pulled on Russell was that he woke him up very early in the morning and said, hey, we're going to go to Disney World, like get your bag packed, let's go, blah, blah, blah. And Russell, being a small child, was very much like, oh my God, we're going to Disney World. Gotta get together. And he packed up and everything and went outside and waited. And Chad was like, LOL, JK, we're not going. There seemed to be a few other reasons why Chad was being disciplined this harshly in regards to his behavior towards Russell. But it seems, in my opinion, not enough to completely suspend their child's living quarters and force them to sleep on a beanbag chair. I mean, the back problems alone that kid could have had just from that kind of living situation. So he revealed that rather casually on the channel, and all the children are laughing. Even Ruby's laughing at some point regarding his explanation of what happened. But a lot of people outside the family, online watching this, were like, that doesn't seem correct. And it started to spark this overall narrative that I don't think Ruby's running on all cylinders up there when it comes to her kids. Another example, which to me, I don't know how this slipped by and no one did anything, but I also understand that like there are limitations legally when it comes to people and their kids. Ruby had sent one of her youngest children to school without lunch. And the child's teacher had reached out to Ruby and said, hey, your child doesn't have a lunch today. Do you mind dropping one off? And Ruby's response to this teacher was to say, well, she said that she packed a lunch and she didn't. So that's kind of on her. She has to starve to understand that it's her responsibility to put her lunch together. Now, I understand that mindset to some extent, not fully by any means. A small extent I can understand is if it's like a child that's in middle school, high school, who's picky about their food and they want to put their own food together. And if they don't, then, it's kind of on them. They have to get lunch to the cafeteria, whatever. But this was a elementary grade child. This was a baby, essentially, in my eyes. Kids are all babies until they're about 10 years old to me. And I cannot recall in any way, shape, or form being responsible for my own meal prep at that age. So for Ruby to sit there and say it's her responsibility when she is literally a child makes no sense. And the fact that the teacher had reached out to her and said, hey, your kid doesn't have food and is going to go hungry, Ruby was like, okay, and? Very much Ariana Grande, yes and, question mark? No sense whatsoever. So a lot of people obviously got really upset about that. And that's kind of where the narrative and the motivation of Ruby being reported for her neglect of her children started to really take fruition. And it got to a point in 2020 where a change.org petition was put together and had garnered over 15,000 signatures requesting for the 8 Passengers channel to be taken down. Because keep in mind, while Ruby is making this content, and although I'm sure there's a good portion of it that doesn't involve this kind of neglectful and abusive nature, Ruby is making a lot of money off of this content. And some of the content is involving her children essentially being abused. Like, neglecting your child's needs, like food, is neglect in my opinion. So a change.org petition was made. Other clips of Ruby's questionable parenting style started leaking, and people were essentially like, I don't know about this. There seems to be a lot of red flags going on, and no one seems to be doing anything congruently. And YouTube was definitely not going to do anything at that point because, well, YouTube tends to really like people who make them money. And family channels, whether we like it or not, make a lot of money. And at 2.5 million followers, YouTube's going to look the other way. So because the family was very proudly and prominently discussing their questionable parenting style, they also started experiencing a lot of harassment from people online. And it got to a point where Franke in about 2020 2019, hired Dave Corrington, a private investigator who had been hired by other vlogger and YouTube personalities to look into people who were ding-dong ditching their doors, calling randomly, and subscribing the family to weird things. Like, they were just getting harassed, okay? As any public figure usually does, right? I'm sure anyone with any kind of internet attention is going to get this kind of weird shit happening to them all the time. The investigator was later on interviewed by Law and Crime and other outlets when the arrest happened in 2023. And they asked, like, hey, was there any indication from you that there was something going on? And the investigator, David, said, no, I really only talked to Kevin. I think I saw Ruby maybe once, but we really didn't speak that much. But what we can take from this is that the family was just, a lot was happening with them, both on the internet and offline, it seems. And there's a lot of stress going on in the household, and they were trying their best to shield their children from this harassment, which, yeah, of course, why would you want to have people ringing your doorbell and running away? That's really annoying. But the thing that David did mention is that he felt that a lot of the harassment they were getting, a lot of it had been provoked by the content that they were posting online. David had said that in his opinion, he didn't feel right about some of the stuff that Ruby and Kevin were posting about or what they were doing with their children. So that obviously prompted people to retaliate and punish them in some way by pranking them and all this other stuff. And around the same time, they decide to send their oldest son, Chad, the one who had kind of been a problem before, who had his entire life and comfort revoked from him because of a harmless, fairly harmless, in my opinion, prank on his younger brother. They decided to send Chad off to a wilderness survival camp for an extended period of time that was not determined when they started sharing it. They're like, yeah, he'll be gone for 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, who knows? And apparently this wilderness survival camp was an attempt to correct him, and it was supposed to be corrective behavioral therapy. I'm not going to get into it, but I have friends that have experienced these kind of things, and they're not, it's not Girl Scout camping in the woods with like your parents or some shit. It was essentially one of those programs for troubled teens, and they ship them off to the mountain area somewhere where they live off the land and off themselves for X amount of time. And then when their will to live is almost broken, they send them back to their homes with the thought that their child is now fixed. So Chad was sent off into this thing, which spurred a lot more conversation, and who's to say whether or not it worked? I don't think that kind of corrective behavioral therapy actually does work, in my opinion, but that's what they did, which again is just further evidence that they have a very strange way of addressing their children's behavioral issues or issues that they find in their children. Who's to say? I honestly think that a lot of the behavior that Ruby deemed to be inappropriate or that needed to be corrected was honestly just kids being kids. Like, siblings are gonna sibling. The fact that no one had their head shaved while they were sleeping or had, like, you know, were on a mattress floating in a lake somewhere, that to me is a success when you have this many kids in a room. 6 children, 6 siblings together? No, the chaos that could have ensued just because of the fact that they're siblings, we need to take a step back and say, okay, let's count our blessings. But the fact that Ruby was internalizing and interpreting this behavior as something that she needs to correct, a bit weird, okay? That's where we're starting off, a bit weird. So because of the change.org petition, police were contacted several times. CPS was contacted from numerous sources multiple times, and police did investigate to some extent and felt that they needed to talk to the kids, but they were denied. And I'm assuming they were denied by the parents. That kind of just makes the most sense to me, or by their lawyers. So the police filed for a warrant and it was submitted to a judge, according to Lieutenant Warner Foster, who was also interviewed regarding the situation. But nothing seemed to develop from that warrant, at least not in the time frame that it needed to happen, because the kids were still with Ruby well into the August 2023 arrest. At least the youngest children were, and nothing was addressed until then. Now, Chad's behavioral therapy didn't end at the Wilderness Survival Program. He actually ended up becoming a patient to Jodi Hildebrandt, who was a highly recommended and recognized family and child therapist in the Mormon community. So Ruby and Jodi were introduced because Jodi became Chad's therapist. And in that therapy, Ruby started to kind of drink the Kool-Aid in some ways when it came to Jodi's rhetoric, and they started to form a bit of a close connection. And at some point, Ruby and Kevin, her husband, who is not mentioned a lot, but he is involved. Trust me, I have a lot to say about that man. Trust me on that. They started becoming patients of Jodi, and because she specialized in couples therapy, relationship therapy, all this kind of stuff, she started to influence Ruby in a lot of ways, both within the therapy she was having with Kevin and outside of it. So at one point, Ruby and Jodi go on a 3 to 4 day trip while Kevin stayed back and took care of the kids. He claims to have had a great time with them, and they probably did, since the more lax parent, or the more, what's the right word? The not disciplinarian of the two parents was present. But when Ruby got back from her trip with Jodi, she decided that Kevin should not be living there anymore and should vacate from the premises immediately. He was apparently shattered by this, and apparently Ruby claimed that he wasn't living in truth and that he was this abusive person and that he was a bad husband to her and that he was a liar and all this stuff. She essentially came back with a completely different mindset than what was actually happening between him and her, and he was taken very aback by this. But because he seems to be a very complacent person when it comes to these kinds of things, I mean, he let Ruby pretty much run amok in their house when it came to their kids. He was like, yeah, sure, okay, and he moved out of their family home almost immediately and had not been present in the house for months after the fact. According to Kevin's attorney, which of course he has an attorney regarding this whole arrest that happened in 2023, Ruby told Kevin that in order for their marriage to work, Kevin would need to leave her for a bit and work on himself. And he did what she said, and he didn't see his children physically for months. Around the time that Kevin moved out of the house, their oldest child, Sherry, started college and, to my understanding, had a little bit of a YouTube presence herself. At some point in her newly obtained adulthood, Sherry began distancing herself from her immediate family, either by her own choice or prompted by her mother, because she's kind of starting to become brainwashed by Jodi in regards to the intentions of other people around her. And it became clear that she wasn't really welcome back to the house and became much closer with her extended family, which I didn't mention this prior, but allow me to do so now. Ruby's sisters, I believe she has 2 sisters. I don't think that's all of them, but there are 2 sisters of Ruby that have their own kind of very prominent family channels as well on YouTube. They seem to have gotten closer with Sherry once Ruby had started indoctrinating herself in Jodi Hildebrandt's nonsense. And because of this nonsense, Ruby was also distancing herself from her sisters as well and her parents, which I'll get more into later because their response to everything and the details that they divulge about what was happening behind the scenes is important to know after the arrest. But just have an understanding that Ruby has 2 sisters that are YouTube stars as well, and they had kind of taken on Sherry more so once she started distancing herself from Ruby and her immediate family. So Kevin moved out, Sherry is excommunicata, and Ruby is all the way up Jodi's ass when it comes to this weird rhetoric. And Ruby starts to form a business type relationship. She says they're not business partners, but she does establish a business type of relationship with Jodi, and they form this kind of parenting advice group called Connections. Now, whether or not Connections existed before Ruby's involvement, I'm unsure of, but Ruby and Jodi were essentially the face of this parenting group called Connections, and it has an X in it, which you see it, right? You see it that it looks like a porn site. I don't know. It's so ironic, just as a side note, because I need to alleviate a little bit of this heaviness a little bit. The fact that their Connections group, their name of it, looks like it would be a website that would connect hot single ladies in your area is very telling to how disconnected these 2 women were from what they were doing. But they formed this Connections group, and they had a Moms of Truth podcast type of content where they would answer these parenting questions that people have and give advice on things that was very much deeply rooted in just I don't even know what to say what it was deeply rooted in. It just seemed like a bunch of bullshit. They were saying things, the usual religious crap or extreme religious crap of your kid shouldn't be gay, it's a sin to have sex early, or it's a sin to have sex outside of marriage, it's a sin to have gay sex, all this stuff. They were saying all this kind of stuff along with this really weird, questionable crap. Like, if your child has an eating disorder, they're lying to you. They don't actually have an eating disorder. They're just not living in truth. Which, what? Your child is not depressed. They're just not living in truth and all this stuff. This whole living in truth concept is like the foundation of Jodi's whole shtick. It's all very accusatory of the children. That like, oh, you're lying about this. You're not living in truth. Which, what does that even mean? The more that I say it and the more I read about it, I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? And this was advice that they were giving to fellow members of the Mormon community. I'm assuming fellow members of the Mormon community because, again, like I said, they kind of rely a lot on each other when it comes to this kind of stuff. But any person that was indulging in this content was being subjected to this absolute fucking buffoonery of, oh, your children are lying about their eating disorder. What? This garnered a lot of attention over time, obviously. People were keeping an eye on Jodi and keeping an eye on Ruby, and they were seeing that Ruby was absolutely getting caught up in whatever Jodi Hildebrandt was putting out. Now let's talk about Miss Jodi Hildebrandt for a moment, shall we? I don't know if I want to, but we're gonna have to. Where to even begin with this one? So Jodi Hildebrandt was the most recommended therapist in the Mormon Community Church in Utah for like 15 to 20 years. A lot of people were referred to Jodi through their bishops or through their religious figures, whatever. And she specialized, in my understanding, in couples therapy and in children's therapy, which is interesting considering the evidence we're about to go through. So because she was such a highly recommended person through the Mormon community or through the Mormon church in Utah, before Ruby met Jodi, Jodi had a very long history of essentially screwing up people's lives, is what I'm going to say. And the most prominent example that has come to light of Jodi's absolute buffoonery is her niece, Jessie. Now, from my understanding, Jessie identifies with they, them pronouns. So I'm going to do my best to respect that. But as I've talked about in other videos regarding they, them pronouns or she, her, he, him, whatever, my brain has a hard time of processing things quickly, so I apologize ahead of time, but they identify as they, them. Jessie Hildebrandt grew up in a Mormon household, and they were considered a little bit of a rebel by their parents. They were always getting into fights. So at some point, their parents had decided to throw up their hands and say, hey, we're not going to deal with you anymore, and decided to ditch Jessie at a family function and leave them in the hands of Jodi. Jodi took them in and said to them, your life as you know it is going to completely change. And oh boy, did it. I'm unsure if they've ever reconnected after Jessie had departed from Jodi's grasp, but from my understanding, they are not on speaking terms, and Jessie is very much focused on healing and, becoming comfortable with who they are. So as a young teenager, they were abandoned by their parents and left to the hands of Jodi Hildebrandt. At home, according to Jessie, Jodi was an absolute monster. She stripped Jessie of any identity, cut their hair, no makeup, no clothing of her own choosing, no school. Jodi decided to pull Jessie out of public school entirely and was homeschooling her. And along the lines of that complete and utter shredding of identity, Jodi also made Jessie go through horrific acts of abuse that were just, I don't even know how someone could process this and say like, yeah, no, that makes sense. It's barbaric. Jodi had duct taped Jessie's mouth because, according to Jodi, Jessie was always lying constantly. So the tape was a physical reminder that every word out of Jessie's mouth was a lie. She was convinced that Jessie was masturbating and knew how to masturbate, even though Jessie admitted at that time that they were unaware that someone with her anatomy was able to masturbate. Like, she did not do any of the things that Jodi was accusing her of. She also forbid Jessie from speaking to other people. When Jodi would go to work, she would lock Jessie up in her closet so that she wouldn't see or hear anyone, and completely and utterly isolated her. And when other adults would come to them and say, hey, are you doing okay? Like, how you doing? Blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. Jessie was instructed by Jodi to just say nothing. Just stare at them completely blank. And Jessie knew if they had said anything to another adult, that person would then go to Jodi with the information, and Jodi's treatment of Jessie would just get worse. Jodi had convinced Jesse that they had completely deserved every horrible thing that Jodi was inflicting on them and then some. And it came to a point where Jesse had said, you know what, I need to go to the police with this. I cannot put up with this any longer, and she did so. In 2010, when Jesse was 16 years old, 16, okay, that is a child to me. She documented a police report stating all the things that Jodi was doing to her at that time: the duct tape on the mouth, sleeping in the snow, restricted bathroom usage, which I didn't even mention that before. She wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom anytime she wanted to. She was forced to wait until Jodi said it was okay. So Jesse had decided in 2010 to go to the police, file a police report, and it went nowhere. She was essentially returned back to Jodi's care, and because Jodi was such a prominent figure in the community, her word was so much heavier than Jesse's was, and Jodi had established this narrative that Jesse was this pathological liar, that anything that came out of her mouth was just an absolute lie. That's why she had the duct tape covered over her all the time. And Jodi had set the precedent that Jesse was not to be trusted, so anything that she went to the police about, they wouldn't believe her because Jodi had more influence than Jesse did, a 16-year-old who's being portrayed to be this horrible liar. It's fucking cuckoo bananas. Jesse went to the police after Jodi had forced them to run around in the snow completely barefoot for hours on end. So Jesse took that opportunity to run away and went straight to the police, where I said the aforementioned police report was filled out. The narrative that Jodi was giving the police was that Jesse was upset with Jodi because Jodi was going to send her off to a boarding school at some point, and Jesse's going to the police and filing this police report was all an act of rebellion against Jodi because she was just looking out for Jesse's best interests. So after Jesse was returned to Jodi from the police, the treatment and abuse that Jodi inflicted on her got immensely worse, and it got to a point where one day Jesse was brought to Jodi's office. Jodi had, I guess, left for a moment or was not present, and Jesse decided to make a run for it. And she ran and never looked back. Jesse, I believe now, is a tattoo artist and a aspiring musician, and seems to be healing themselves from the horrific abuse they had endured under Jodi. And once the arrest of Ruby and Jodi came to public, or became public knowledge, Jesse decided to come forward and share her experience because she feels that although Ruby absolutely deserves to be criticized, ridiculed, punished, and reprimanded for her treatment of her own children, Jesse doesn't want the focus to not also be on Jodi, because Jodi, in Jesse's opinion, from my understanding in her interviews with various sources, is that Jodi is the mastermind behind all of this mistreatment. Like, yeah, Ruby was like a cuckoo banana bitch before. Sorry. Yeah, Ruby was a horrible, abusive in some ways mother to her children way before Jodi became involved, but the escalation to the physical abuse that we're going to detail in a little bit was all Jodi, according to Jesse. It's all Jodi's doing. It's all her teaching. All this living in truth nonsense is what propelled the abuse of Ruby Franke's children. Just to wrap up this segment on Jodi before we get into what happened on the night of the arrest in August 2023, I want to share the two experiences that were detailed by two former patients of Jodi Hildebrandt. One, who goes by the name Adam, was recommended by his bishop to go see Jodi for his marriage. Now, at first, it was group therapy. Adam and his wife and 5 other couples had joined this group, and at first it was very positive and very helpful. But shortly after the therapy had begun, Jodi decided to separate the wives and husbands into 2 separate groups, and the things that she was telling the wives was completely different from what she was talking about with the men. Jodi was telling the group of wives that the husbands in their group therapy sessions were admitting to horrible acts of sexual abuse, of all this other stuff, saying that their husbands were just these awful, violent men and were admitting to horrible, heinous acts in the men's group, and that Jodi was essentially brainwashing the group of wives to think that their husbands were these awful, horrible men when they absolutely were not. Specifically with Adam, she accused him to his wife that he was a child rapist, he raped women, and none of this was true. And because of these narratives, these made up, completely untrue narratives that Jodi was perpetuating to these women, Adam's wife decided to not only leave him, but to also file a restraining order against him and have his children completely taken away from him. And Jodi was helping his wife build this whole case against him, that he's this awful, horrible person. Along with destroying his marriage, Jodi was also taking these completely made up allegations and confessions, if you want to call them that. She was sharing it with people that he worked with fellow church members, fellow church higher ups, and other mental health professionals without his permission. And I want you to really understand this for a second. She was speaking about her patient's conditions and all this private stuff with other people without his permission, which is not only psychotic, but is a complete and utter violation of doctor-patient confidentiality. So Adam took it upon himself to start building a case against Jodi. And I'm talking binders full, okay? He did several interviews once the arrest came to light and everyone was kind of looking into what Jodi Hildebrandt was about. He had built such a case against her that he reported Jodi to the state of Utah for acting unethically. And in 2012, Utah's Division of Professional Licensing put her license on an 18-month probation as they came to understand through Adam that she was sharing personal information about him with members of the Mormon Church and with the university in which he attended and worked at. Because of those allegations, he was subsequently expelled from the college and from the church in 2009 and was not able to gain his credibility back until he reported her in 2012. So 3 years of his life, he was being made up to be this horrible, violent, abusive person, and he just was not. What her motivation is in all this, I have no idea. I have no fucking clue. It seems absolutely delusional. Another patient that Jodi had also had his marriage completely destroyed. His name is Bryce, and he was also recommended to go see Jodi for his marriage with his wife by his bishop. And he claimed that she was just hyper focused on his sexuality, about his indulgence in porn. All this like weird nitty gritty stuff that really doesn't seem to have any kind of basis. Like he was going to her to get therapy for his relationship so that him and his wife could have like a good foundation for themselves. And she's sitting there like, what about the porn? Like, ma'am? According to Bryce, Jodi would regularly use shaming tactics on her patients. She had such an impact on them that at one point, he recalled that another patient, he got his own apartment because he was so ashamed of just looking at another woman. Jodi made this man feel so bad about himself for just doing a double take on a woman that was not his wife that he got his own apartment. Now, I know some of you are sitting there like, and like fully sure, yeah, whatever. If you feel that way, okay. But that should not be coming from the therapist. That is a conversation that should be happening between the couple, and the therapist should just be playing an unbiased bystander and like referee in that regard. She should not be sitting there saying, yeah, absolutely kick his ass out. He's a horrible person and he's an R word and all this other stuff. Like she was just filling up these women's head with absolute fucking nonsense. Jodi had made him feel like the absolute scum of the earth, along with these other male patients. And that's what I'm kind of starting to notice as I'm reading through these notes and discussing it with you right now, that Jodi hyper fucking focuses on the men's way of living, like when it comes to pornography and sexuality and all this stuff. She really focuses in on them and makes them feel and seem like these awful people, and then she turns the wives into these like victims, and that they need her in order to get by with all this horrible abuse they've experienced from their husbands, when none of it is real. Like this is all coming from her. 20 years. Okay, up to 20 years she was recommended as a therapist for these people. Who knows how many marriages she completely and utterly destroyed, or how many people's identities she had completely and utterly eradicated with this absolute fucking delusional nonsense. But that's enough about Jodi. I think you have a clear understanding of who we're dealing with right now. So we have Ruby Franke, who before Jodi Hildebrandt's involvement was a very unnecessarily strict and borderline abusive parent. And once Jodi Hildebrandt came into the picture, who was this fucking license revoked for 18 months patient-doctor confidentiality fucking breaking psychopath. These two get together in about 2020, 2021, form connections, and essentially become this horrific duo. This is a bad combination. These two women together. And it truly only got worse from there. Now we're going to talk about the night of the arrest. And I'm going to do my best to just read off of my notes because this is a lot, so apologies for the lack of eye contact. On the night of August 30th, 2023, one of the children of Ruby and Kevin Franke escaped from the home of Jodi Hildebrandt. That child, who is referred to as RF in the police report, is 12 years old, ran to a neighbor's home where he asked for food and water. He also asked for the neighbor to call 911. At first, it seems like he had climbed through a window on the phone call with the neighbor, but he says that he left through the front door on the porch. Either way, he escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's home, and we assume he left the residence in a very hasty fashion because he was in fear for his life. That neighbor then proceeded to call 911, and I'll link the video down below of the recording if you feel a need to listen to it. I've listened to it a couple times, and it's just heartbreaking, but you can tell that this man is just absolutely distraught with the condition this child was in. And he says, and I quote, "He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry and he's thirsty." Ruby Franke is his mom's name. This child has obviously been, he's just covered in wounds. He says he doesn't know where his mom is. He just said he doesn't live around here. And in this statement, as you can tell from the pauses, you can tell that this man is getting so emotional by the state of this child. The neighbor also briefly explains that there's been trouble at Jodi's house before. What exactly that's in reference to, I'm unsure, but as I've stated before, in regards to Jesse Hildebrandt's experience, they were forced to work outside in the snow, in the heat, and regardless if Jodi wanted to or not, people were going to obviously see that this child or any children outside of Jodi's home are being forced to do intense labor in extreme weather conditions. So obviously the neighbors had some kind of inkling that something was up, along with the fact that like Jodi and Ruby had posted very publicly about their parenting advice and style and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sure they had some awareness of who Jodi and Ruby are, but what exactly the neighbor's referring to, I'm unsure of at this moment. The dispatcher asked the child to clarify if he knows where his other siblings are and if they are in the same state that he's in. The child said that there's 2 other children at the house, one is 14 and one is 10. The neighbor struggles to ask him if his siblings are also abused, and the child responds that his current state is his own fault. His siblings are fine, and the neighbor and the dispatcher are just absolutely, obviously heartbroken by this, and the dispatcher replies with, "That's sad to hear." So this child that escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's house and has wounds on his ankles, his feet, his body, is malnourished and starving, thirsty, all of these conditions. And somehow he is convinced that this is his own fault. I think we need a second. We need a second to just absorb that, because no person, let alone any child, should ever feel like this kind of treatment is not only deserved, but justified in any way, shape, or form. And later on, Ruby and Jodi try and pull some bullshit saying that like, oh, this child's a danger to society. Bitch, no, you are a danger to society, and thank fucking Christ you're getting locked the fuck up. So when the police arrived, they confirmed that his wounds were severe and that he was being bound using duct tape. It's later on revealed that these wounds were being treated with honey and spice powder, which I'm sure only made the wounds worse. Like, what the fuck? You're gonna abuse this kid and not even give him a fucking band-aid? You're gonna pour honey and spice powder on it? Like, ugh. Now, according to RF, the child that escaped initially, there were 2 other children at the house, but once the police got there was only 1 other child, and they referred to that child as EF. There was only 2 kids found at the house at the time, from my understanding. There's 4 total underage kids. 1 went to the neighbor's house and called the police. One was left there in the similar state that he was in. A third child is actually with one of Ruby's friends at a completely different residence, which we'll get into in a second. And the fourth one, I'm unclear on where their whereabouts were. If they were actually at the house or if they were somewhere else, I'm not sure. The police retrieved the other child from the house. And like I said, I think it's the youngest kid of the group. And the two babies had been tied up and duct taped, completely malnourished, and the police absolutely did not waste any time arresting Jodi and Ruby. They were arrested with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse, a felony that can carry a maximum of 15 years in prison each. So 6 counts times 15, what is that? Sorry, that's a lot of math. According to my calculator, that is potentially 90 years in prison, which honestly, yes, you absolutely deserve it. So given the fact that Ruby and Jodi had kind of established themselves online as these parental self-help people on one end, and on the other end, people saw them as these horribly abusive and neglectful people and parents, and that their rhetoric is just beyond the word of questionable, and at this point it's just downright destructive. When their arrest was made, I remember exactly where I was because in July, this is a bit of a personal note, but in July, I had experienced a really bad car accident and I was at home on bed rest for several months. And I remember I was on my phone when the alert came through that these two had been arrested. And I was like, everyone needs to be fucking quiet. I need to watch this. And it was just, to me, it was like, it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't surprising. We all knew, at least the YouTube community as a whole knew. So when this hit, everyone was like, yeah, knew it was happening, but we didn't know the extent in which it was happening. There's a huge difference between forcing your child to sleep on a beanbag chair for months on end and actually tying up your child with duct tape and forcing honey and cinnamon into their wounds. Like, this was unimaginable in some ways, but I don't think anyone was necessarily surprised, if that makes sense. Jodi and Ruby sat before a judge shortly after their arrest, and both of them looked absolutely in shock that they were there, which, excuse me? Like, you shouldn't be that surprised, Ruby. But they were both held without bail because of the extent of the abuse. And at that time that they were arrested and before a judge, we didn't know the extent of the abuse. All we knew is that one of the children escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's house and called the police through the neighbor. And the neighbor was very emotional about what was going on. So part of the basis of the aggravated child abuse is that besides the fact that these children in Jodi Hildebrandt's house were covered in wounds and malnourished and completely neglected, a YouTube video was filmed and posted 2 days prior to the night of the arrest and was essentially proof that both Ruby and Jodi knew what was going on in the household and were aware of the fact that these kids were being completely and utterly abused. Now, at this point, we didn't know exactly who was abusing the kids. We just knew that Ruby and Jodi were in the house when these children were being neglected. And at the time I wrote these notes, I felt that it was probably Jodi inflicting the abuse and Ruby was just kind of allowing it to happen. But later on, we'll have an understanding that Ruby also had a hand in the abuse because of course she did. Why wouldn't she? When arrested, both women chose to remain silent and requested their legal counsel to be present before speaking to police. The only remark Jodi made towards the police is that neither of the children that were left in her home, the ones with the bruises and abuse marks all over their body, they should not be allowed to be with any other children. And this is a really interesting tactic, or I guess attempt at a tactic of isolation and gaslighting, because that's exactly what she did to Jessie all those years ago when she was in Jodi's care. My understanding is after the arrest that the rest of the children, all 4 of them that were underage, were put into state custody, and Kevin Franke, who was fucking where was this man? Where was this man? I'm sorry, now I'm about to get into it because I'm so pissed off. Because if you as a parent, if one of the other parents in the room is literally acting like a fucking moron and is abusing your children, Kevin, these are your fucking kids, and you allowed them to be fucking abused like this. You had every right in every world to go to the house and be like, I'm taking these kids away from you, Ruby, because you're a fucking psychopath, and Jodi for that matter, who wasn't even Oh, Jodi is some fucking random ass bitch off the street who is just apparently has more authority over his children than Kevin does. And where's Kevin? He's fucked off for months. He's nowhere to be fucking found. Like, I'm sorry. As a parent, if you're gonna stand there and be like, oh, these kids deserve to be released to me, which is the argument that Kevin was making once the kids were in state custody. He was saying like, oh, they should be released into my care. And he was like fighting for them and stuff. Where the fuck were you, sir? Where were you? This has been going on for months. Oh, it makes me so mad. It makes me so mad because it didn't have to get to this. Okay. All right, there's my outburst. It's done. So just to also reiterate exactly how bad the abuse is at the time of the arrest, documents detail that the state of the child's abuse, the one who escaped, that the duct tape had been used on him because the handcuffs had ripped into his skin so much that it had damaged the bone. And where was fucking Kevin? No fucking clue. Your child is being held down by handcuffs on his hands and feet to the point where it has damaged the bone. And where the fuck were you? Oh, I'm getting so mad again. Sorry. The outburst was not done, obviously. So the arrest happened in August of 2023. On September 18th, Ruby and Jodi appear virtually before a judge. They don't speak much, but you can tell that both of them are fucking spooked the fuck out. Ruby is much more stone-faced than Jodi. Jodi looks like she's actually on the brink of crying, which honestly, good. Good. You deserve worse, bitch. At that time, neither one of them had made a plea, but it was obvious that they were about to be fucked. Talking about Kevin a little bit more, and I'm going to try my best to keep my cool. Okay, I have my outburst, and hopefully it's done, but we'll see. Like I mentioned, Kevin attempts to get the kids into his custody, and then he's saying all this stuff that he's a good parent, and he has no idea what's going on, and he just wants his kids back, and his lawyer is saying all this stuff, making statements saying that all Kevin wants to do is reunite with his family, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, his oldest daughter, Sherry, remember her? Okay, the oldest one who got the fuck out of there as soon as she could. She is being charged by her own father with burglary because Sherry went back to the Franke house after the arrest to take some personal items. I'm assuming it's probably like laptops, hard drives, like all this stuff, because the YouTube channel, the 8 Passengers YouTube channel, was taken down at some point, and a lot of the evidence about Ruby's horrific parental fucking strategies was no longer documented in that way. So I think Sherry went back to the house to get the raw files of all that information, and Kevin, who had not even stepped foot into that house for months, tried to charge her with burglary. 13 months. That's how long he was not in that house. 13 fucking months. And he's standing there saying like, oh, why are you taking my stuff? I just want my family to be back together. I'm going to charge my oldest daughter with fucking burglary. I honestly have no idea how Kevin's not also being arrested or charged in some degree because like, I guess he wasn't around for most of it. Obviously, he was fucking disappeared for 13 months. Shortly after the information about him charging Sherry with burglary came out, a video of body cam footage was also released showing the police returning the items that Sherry took from the Franke household and it was being returned back to Kevin. I'm assuming after she got whatever she needed to out of them, like she extracted whatever raw data or whatever she needed out of those electronics. It was like a laptop and a cameras and a few things. And he is still insisting after the fact, after he already attempted to get her arrested for burglary, after all this stuff, he's still insisting that something should be done about this and is being so rude to the police about it, saying like, well, I guess I'll have to look into that further, even though they're very politely explaining to him like, hey, you haven't been in the house for 13 months. She was not taking them with the intention to deprive you of these items. She was just taking them to give to the police to turn over evidence. So there's not really a jurisdiction for us to arrest her in because there was not really a crime being committed. And he's like, guess I'll have to look into that further. That's why you're bald, sir. Just in case you were wondering, that's why you're bald. So as I mentioned, Ruby had 2 sisters that were also like momfluencers or family vlogging channels, and both had responded to the situation at hand. And I'm going to briefly talk about their statements because as well-intentioned as they are, I really feel that neither one of them really should have said anything other than like, I know what happened. I'm not going to discuss it any further, like for the sake of the children, and that's it. And in my opinion, again, I feel like they really made the focus of this whole thing on themselves rather than on the kids that were being physically fucking abused. But I need to mention it for the sake of context, I suppose. So Bonnie, one of Ruby's sisters, posted a video that she couldn't speak much of it due to a judge's request, because at that point they were arrested, and it's one of those things where if they do go to court or if they do go through with like a jury and stuff like that, she could potentially ruin some things and get charged with like jury tampering or some shit. I don't know the full extent of it, but I do know that if a judge says, hey, please don't talk about this, you should not fucking talk about it. But in her video, she is mad as hell. She didn't know anything about the alleged abuse, and she was completely cut off from everything because Ruby had taken that same rhetoric that Jodi was shoving down her throat and everyone else's throat and brought it to family gatherings and tried instilling the same kind of fucked up mentality into her sisters. And they were like, please no, we don't want this around you. We don't want to be around this anymore. Please do not. And at one point, Ruby had decided to remove herself completely because both of her sisters both had essentially said, hey, we don't like this connections thing. We think it's not right for you. We feel that like this is not 100% correct in any kind of way. And we feel like you're being corrupted. And Ruby was like, I'm just gonna leave then, deuces. The other sister also posted a video essentially saying the same thing of like, hey, we didn't know exactly how bad the abuse was. We just knew that something was going on and we knew that something was up with Ruby, and none of us liked this connections nonsense, and we all felt that Jodi was not a good person or a good influence to have around. But they were also limited legally in what they could do. It's not like Bonnie could go into Ruby's house and take her kids away from her. That would be considered kidnapping. So they were only able to do so much, which like, okay, yeah, sure. I'll give them that. I'm not even going to say anything else. Sure. But both of them blame Kevin for not stepping up and doing something that he easily could have done within his legal right as their fucking biological father. And as I mentioned before, they both kind of make the situation more about them and their kids, which again, I understand, like, you're a parent, you have to put your kids first. You're apparently the only fucking parents in this whole situation that seem to be thinking about their kids. And they, again, didn't know exactly what the legal ramifications or the legal jurisdiction they had in order to actually help Ruby's kids out. So they were more of like, I don't want to say bystanders, but they definitely did only what they seemed was appropriate at the time and didn't have the understanding of what was actually going on because Ruby had completely isolated herself from her family. Also, additionally, both sisters revealed that Ruby was accusing their parents of horrible neglect and all this kinds of stuff, saying that her parents abused her and other things, when that, according to the sisters, never happened, and that Ruby was just acting off of delusion, and they knew it was coming from Jodi. Julie DeRoe is the other sister. I don't know if I mentioned that. Also, one of Kevin's, I think his nephew, his name is Matthew Franke, spoke to KUTV2 News Salt Lake City. That's a long fucking name. He described it as a train wreck you can't look away from. He hadn't seen Ruby for over 10 years at that point, and he was concerned about Jodi's influence and described it as cultish, which, yeah. Following the arrest, following all the family statements, following all the statements from Jodi's, past people, like Jodi Hildebrandt, her patients, all this stuff, there was a custody hearing where Ruby was involved because these are her kids that were being abused. And Ruby had claimed that her one son, we're assuming the one that was in the handcuffs that went down to the bone and damaged him internally. Ruby claims that this one was addicted to pornography. She claimed that he had sexually abused other children in the home and provided absolutely no proof of this. I feel this is Jodi's influence speaking based on the things that Jessie was saying in her statements and her recollection of being with Jodi. And she's using the same tactics that Jodi had used on Jessie, where she's completely dismantling someone's character and destroying their credibility with absolutely no proof. In other court documents from that same custody hearing, Ruby claimed that the child that was being tortured admitted to these sins and that he was being abusive to other children, and they felt justified in the torture. And a point that Jodi Hildebrandt brought up in her statements is that of course they admit to these things because you're telling them as you're torturing them that if they just admit to what they've done, the torture will stop. And at some point, regardless if you're a child, if you're an adult, whatever, if you are being tortured the way that these women were torturing these kids, I would say fucking anything to make it stop. I I would say the sky is green. I would say that water is not H2O. It's fucking CP3O. Whatever. Like, anything to make it stop. According to other statements made, that the child who escaped, RF, that was referred to in the police report, he was allegedly forced to work outside in the sweltering heat with no shoes. He had blisters and sunburns all over his body. He was denied water and was punished for sneaking water when he could. And he was given bland food and denied any kind of access to electronics, notebooks, entertainment of any kind, nothing. These poor fucking kids, man. I really hope the best for them. I do. Jesus Christ. So after all of this, and after all of everything, Jodi and Ruby both pled guilty to only 4 of the 6 counts charged against them, which I think is understandable considering there was only 4 children, I believe, in the house at the time. The other 2 were already gone at that point. They were of age. So I think they dropped it down to 4, and they both pled guilty to it. Now, recently in February 2023, earlier this week that I'm recording this, Ruby and Jodi both made statements in their sentencing hearing to the judge. And there's a lot to be said about this. According to the prosecutor in the sentencing hearing, Ruby has shown a great deal of remorse when it comes to her actions towards her kids, and in her statement, she says that she is so eternally sorry for everything she's done to them and all this kind of stuff. It kind of feels a bit empty in some places, and then she goes on this long, like, thank you list of everyone who intercepted, like, the people at the hospital who helped her kids heal. She apologizes to Kevin for making him feel like a piece of shit, which I don't think you need to apologize for that, honey. He's still acting like a piece of shit. And that she's more than willing to do whatever amount of time is necessary in order to not only heal herself from being brainwashed from Jodi, but also to heal her family for the horrible things she's inflicted on them. I'll link the videos below if you're interested in watching them. I do think it's worth noting, and I'm going to be very careful with how I say this. I do feel for Ruby in a small, teeny, itsy-bitsy little way because she was so heavily corrupted by Jodi. But honestly, the foundation of Ruby and who she was and how neglectful and abusive she was to her kids, that foundation was there far before Jodi got there. Okay, she was already a bit of a bad parent and horrible and inflicting terrible treatment onto her kids way before Jodi got there. Jodi just made it worse. And Jodi's statement, girl, Jodi had pretty much been caught with her pants down because while she was in jail, she made phone calls that were obviously monitored. Like, I don't know what, this woman's fucking stupid. She was making phone calls and saying that she's the victim, these kids are evil, and everything being said in court is going to be a lie and all this stuff. And she's not remorseful. She doesn't really show any remorse for her actions, and neither does her lawyer. Her lawyer basically says, like, Jodi is willing to accept responsibility for what's happened. Like, it's giving incompetent, it's giving moronic, it's giving victim blaming, it's giving victimization. And honestly, I cannot imagine being arrested, charged, booked, in prison, in jail for this kind of shit and still get in front of a judge and say, like, it's the kid's fault. There are 2 sides to every story. When the fucking lawyer said that, when the defense attorney said that, oh yeah, there's 2 sides to every story. These are children. And the judge in that sentencing hearing spoke up. He's like, usually I agree with you, but like, what's the other side of this? Like, Jodi had every opportunity to say whatever she needed to say to the police when she was arrested, and she never fucking did. And the lawyer was like, oh, well, she's going to do that now. And then she did it, and she didn't say anything. So Jodi and Ruby have both pled guilty to these 4 charges, and I believe the way Utah works is that they are going to serve a minimum 4 years, 1 year for each count, or a maximum of like 15 years for each count. So they could theoretically be in jail for only 4 years, or they can be in there for like 30 plus years. It depends. And the way Utah's laws seem to work is that they'll be in jail for the minimum of 4 years, and then they can be reevaluated and, you know, good behavior and all that bullshit. They might be let out. I personally don't think Jodi will be let off the hook that easily, considering, like, yeah, she was not the parent, like Ruby was the parent of these children, but she was a mental health and psychological professional who was supposed to take care of kids. And that's exactly what the judge said in the hearing. You are supposed to be someone who protects children, and you did the exact opposite of that. So I don't think Jodi's going to get out in less than 4 years for sure. I think she'll probably end up serving much longer than Ruby. Ruby showed a lot of remorse in her statement, and she was very apologetic towards everyone and everything, but I do think she's lacking a lot of self-awareness in this regard and how she contributed to getting in the situation. So we'll see. In conclusion, I'm unsure of whether or not the kids are back in Kevin's custody or if they're still in the state's custody. I would absolutely see the argument of not returning them to Kevin's custody, because where the fuck has that man been? Just know, Kevin Franke, if I see you, it's on sight. I can imagine that because Sherry and Chad are older and are like legal adults, that they could probably fight to have custody for the kids. And there were absolutely points in like the 8 Passengers lore where Sherry was acting much more of a mother figure than Ruby was, like a nurturing mother figure. She would help the kids get ready and all that kind of stuff. So I can see her fighting for custody and then like Chad also helping out. But honestly, if those kids end up in like a foster home with 2 loving parents, I think that would also be a good outcome for them. Going over all of this, like abuse of any kind is just unacceptable in any way, shape, or form. It's just not necessary in this. It's just not necessary in this kind of. We're in a society where that kind of shit should not be fucking happening. We have the resources, we have the technology, we have the mindsets to not allow this shit to happen, and yet it went on for years. Years this went on for. And these poor kids are going to have to spend the rest of their lives. That's the thing I don't think Ruby and Jodi understand, is that it's not about the wounds, right? Wounds heal. Boo-boos get better. Scars heal. The psychological damage these 2 women inflicted on these fucking children, it's going to take a lifetime to undo. A lifetime. And you know what? I don't think in any way, shape, or form Ruby has any right to contact her kids if she gets out of jail. And she should let them just live their lives without her. And if they choose to connect with her, that's on them. Good for them for healing. Ruby needs to just fucking sit the fuck down in a corner by herself. And honestly, Jodi should not be let out into society. That's exactly what the prosecution said during the sentencing hearing too. So with all of that said, I'm going to give my final few thoughts and we're going to wrap up this video, and hopefully this is the last we hear of the 8 Passengers' children and they can live the rest of their lives happily offline. As I said, I don't think Ruby's going to do the full sentence, like the full extent of the sentences for her charges, because she showed a lot of remorse, and I'm sure that's going to go a long way with the review board once her, whatever the process is when they apply to like be let out, I don't know what the correct terminology is. Like I said, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure Ruby in some way will be able to get out with good behavior. Jodi does not show remorse. I think she's like a Charles Manson type of person where her delusions are truth and there's nothing to really say to her about it. And like I said, Jodi was a very influential member of the Mormon community for like damn near 20 years. So I'm sure she's got a buddy or 2 on the other side that would help her out. But at least the fact that both of these women will be in jail for 4 years at the minimum is some kind of relief, I think. Does it balance out the horrid abuse both of them inflicted on many people? Like the amount of jail time Jodi should actually face because of all the bullshit she put her patients through, her own family through. She would be in jail forever, but those charges are not the one that were made. They were Ruby Franke's children. And on Ruby's end, I don't know. It's hard because, like I said, she showed a lot of remorse, but those were her kids. Those were her children, her flesh and blood, that she allowed to be abused, either by her own hand or by Jodi's. So who's to say? My hope is that the kids just heal and move on and have wonderful, happy lives after this. They absolutely deserve it. Beyond the abuse, like the fact that they were documented so much of their lives, so much of their personal stuff has been online forever. I hope that they get to a place where they don't feel that exposed to the public, especially with this going on too. Like, not that this should have been a private matter by any means, but I don't know. A lot of their business has been put out there, and if I were them, I would absolutely just avoid any kind of exposure to the internet moving forward. From my understanding, Sherry still has a YouTube channel. I don't know if she's active on it. I don't know anything about Chad either, but for the rest of the kids, I hope that wherever they are, they're safe, they're in good hands, and I hope they can reconnect with the family members that love and cherish them the way that they deserve to be loved and cherished. As far as Kevin, he should be in jail too, in my opinion. He should be in jail. There's no way he should be getting away with this and walking around scot-free like he didn't fucking participate in this bullshit either. Or that he didn't allow this bullshit to happen. Like, I'm still not over it. Where the fuck were you for 13 months? You didn't think to pop by the house and make sure that everything was okay? Like, that man, he's bald for a reason. Bald. If the Franke children decide to stay connected with their parents and rekindle their relationship with their mother, that's completely and utterly their choice. And we, as the general public, don't really have a right to say whether or not that's wrong or not. But I do think that they deserve a lot of time to heal, to reconnect with themselves, to go back to school, to have some kind of sense of normalcy. Because even before the horrible extent of this abuse went to in the last few years, everything prior, they never had a normal life. They always had a camera in their face. They had all their business put out there. Like, they deserve to have a sense of normalcy, and they deserve to have a healthy, happy life. So that's all I want for them. And I want Ruby to fucking sit the fuck down for a little bit. I want Jodi to just jump off a cliff, but that's me personally. But yeah, that is the situation, start to finish. Now, there's obviously like detail here and there that I decided to omit or decided to not include just for the sake of brevity. But as I said before at the beginning, I will absolutely be linking some stuff below if you're interested in doing some further research. It is a lot, and there's definitely been a good amount of documentation, especially the Law and Crime channel. Markie has also done a great job of keeping up with this kind of stuff, and a lot of people have taken a lot of time to document every single update that's come forward. So as I said, I'll link everything down below. But I think what we can take from this moving forward is that you never know how bad someone has it at home, and that everyone should just navigate this life with love and understanding, and most of all, compassion, because these kids, it was just so unnecessary for them to go through this experience. It just wasn't, no one needed this. No one needed this. So, just a quick personal update before I fully wrap up this video. I'm sure for like the 5 people that are watching this, you've noticed that I haven't really been active on here for the last year, and that's due to a lot of personal reasons, most of which is the fact that I was working in a very toxic work environment for a while, and then I also experienced a very traumatic personal event that involved a car accident, and I have definitely been reevaluating my priorities since then, and my life has rippled in ways that I did not expect in any way, shape, or form. And I appreciate if you've come back despite the fact that I've been so absent, because this is a channel that I really love and I really enjoy doing this kind of thing. And I apologize again for being absent. I'm sorry. I've been dealing with a lot. But with that being said, I am planning on coming back full force on YouTube. I have a lot of ideas coming up, and a good portion of them do not really involve too much drama, so to speak. So if you're interested in that kind of content, I will definitely be sprinkling it in here and there. But I'm trying to navigate towards a more fun and creative avenue on this channel. So if you want to stick around, or you haven't already, please subscribe to come along on this messy journey with me. And yeah, thanks for watching. Appreciate you hanging out with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye!